Preface of a General Introduction to Psychoanalysis. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ashley Jane. A General Introduction to Psychoanalysis by Sigmund Freud. Translated by Granville Stanley Hall. Preface. Few, especially in this country, realize that while Freudian themes have rarely found a place on the programs of the American Psychological Association, they have attracted great and growing attention and found frequent elaboration by students of literature, history, biography, sociology, morals and aesthetics, anthropology, education, and religion. They have given the world a new conception of both infancy and adolescence, and shed much new light upon characterology, given us a new and clearer view of sleep, dreams, reveries, and revealed hitherto unknown mental mechanisms common to normal and pathological states and processes, showing that the law of causation extends to the most incoherent acts and even verbigerations in insanity, gone far to clear up the terra incognita of hysteria, taught us to recognize morbid symptoms, often neurotic and psychotic in their germ, revealed the operations of the primitive mind so overlaid and repressed that we had almost lost sight of them, fashioned and used the key of symbolism to unlock many mysticisms of the past, and in addition to all this, effected thousands of cures, established a new prophylaxis, and suggested new tests for character, disposition, and ability, in all combining the practical and theoretic to a degree salutary as it is rare. These 28 lectures to laymen are elementary and almost conversational. Freud sets forth with a frankness and almost startling the difficulties and limitations of psychoanalysis, and also describes its main methods and results as only a master and originator of a new school of thought can do. These discourses are at the same time simple and almost confidential, and they trace and sum up the results of 30 years of devoted and painstaking research. While they are not all controversial, we incidentally see a clearer light the distinctions between the master and some of his distinguished pupils. A text like this is the most opportune and will naturally more or less supersede all other introductions to the general subject of psychoanalysis. It presents the author in a new light, as an effective and successful popularizer, and is certain to be welcomed not only by the large and growing number of students of psychoanalysis in this country, but by the yet larger number of those who wish to begin its study here and elsewhere. The impartial student of Sigmund Freud need not agree with all his conclusions, and indeed, like the present writer, may be unable to make sex so all-dominating a factor in the psychic life of the past and present as Freud deems it to be, to recognize the fact that he is the most original and creative mind in psychology of our generation. Despite the frightful handicap of the odium sexicum, far more formidable today than the odium theologicum, involving as it has done for him lack of academic recognition, and even more or less social ostracism, his views have attracted and inspired a brilliant group of minds, not only in psychiatry, but in many other fields, who have altogether given the world of culture more new and pregnant apicus than those which have come from any other source within the wide domain of humanism. A former student and disciple of Wundt, who recognizes to the full his inestimable services to our science, cannot avoid making certain comparisons. Wundt has had for decades the prestige of a most advantageous academic chair. He founded the first laboratory for experimental psychology, which attracted many of the most gifted and mature students from all lands. By his development of the doctrine of apperception he took psychology forever beyond the old associationism which had ceased to be fruitful. He also established the independence of psychology from physiology, and by his encyclopedic and always thronged lectures, to say nothing of his more or less esoteric seminary, he materially advanced every branch of mental science and extended its influence over the whole wide domain of folklore, mores, language, and primitive religion. His best texts will long constitute a thesaurus which every psychologist must know. Again, like Freud, he inspired students who went beyond him, the Würzburgers and introspectionists, whose method and results he could not follow. His limitations have grown more and more manifest. He has little use for the unconscious or the abnormal, and for the most part he has lived and wrought in a pre-evolutionary age, and always and everywhere underestimated the genetic standpoint. He never transcends the conventional limits in dealing, as he so rarely does, with sex. Nor does he contribute much likely to be permanent value in any part of the wide domain of affectivity. We cannot forbear to express the hope that Freud will not repeat Wundt's error in making too abrupt a break with his more advanced pupils like Adler or the Zurich group. It is rather precisely just the topics that Wundt neglects that Freud makes his chief cornerstones, viz. The unconscious, the abnormal sex, and affectionately generally, with many genetic, especially ontogenetic, but also phylogenetic factors. The Wundtian influence has been great in the past, while Freud has a great present and yet greater future. In one thing Freud agrees with the introspectionist, viz. In deliberately neglecting the physiological factor, and building on purely psychological foundations, although for Freud psychology is mainly unconscious, while for the introspectionist it is pure consciousness. Neither he nor his disciples have yet recognized the aid proffered them by students of the autonomic system, or by the distinctions between the epicritic and protopathic functions and organs of the cerebrum, although these will doubtless come to have their due place as we know more of the nature and processes of the unconscious mind. If psychologists of the normal have hitherto been too disposed to recognize the precious contributions to psychology made by the cruel experiments of nature in mental diseases, we think that the psychoanalysts who work predominantly in this field have been somewhat too ready to apply their findings to the operations of the normal mind. But we are optimistic enough to believe that in the end both these errors will vanish, and that in the great synthesis of the future that now seems to impend our science will be made vastly richer and deeper on the theoretical side, and also far more practical than it has ever been before. G. Stanley Hall, Clark University, April, 1920. End of preface. Section 1 of A General Introduction to Psychoanalysis by Sigmund Freud. Translated by Granville Stanley Hall. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ashley Jane. Section 1. First Lecture. Introduction. I do not know how familiar some of you may be, either from your reading or from hearsay, with psychoanalysis. But in keeping with the title of these lectures, A General Introduction to Psychoanalysis, I am obliged to proceed as though you knew nothing about this subject and stood in need of preliminary instruction. To be sure, this much I may presume that you do know, namely, that psychoanalysis is a method of treating nervous patients medically. And just at this point I can give you an example to illustrate how the procedure in this field is precisely the reverse of that which is the rule in medicine. Usually when we introduce a patient to a medical technique which is strange to him, we minimize its difficulties and give him confident promises concerning the result of the treatment. When, however, we undertake psychoanalytic treatment with a neurotic patient, we proceed differently. We hold before him the difficulties of the method, its length, the exertions and the sacrifices which it will cost him. And as to the result, we tell him that we make no definite promises, that the result depends on his conduct, on his understanding, on his adaptability, on his perseverance. We have, of course, excellent motives for conduct, which seems so perverse, and into which you will perhaps gain insight at a later point in these lectures. Do not be offended, therefore, if, for the present, I treat you as I treat these neurotic patients. Frankly, I shall dissuade you from coming to hear me a second time. With this intention, I shall show what imperfections are necessarily involved in the teaching of psychoanalysis, and what difficulties stand in the way of gaining a personal judgment. I shall show you how the whole trend of your previous training and all your accustomed mental habits must unavoidably have made you opponents of psychoanalysis, and how much you must overcome in yourselves in order to master this instinctive opposition. Of course, I cannot predict how much psychoanalytic understanding you will gain from my lectures, but I can promise this, that by listening to them you will not learn how to undertake a psychoanalytic treatment or how to carry one to completion. Furthermore, should I find any one among you who does not feel satisfied with a cursory acquaintance with psychoanalysis, but who would like to enter into a more enduring relationship with it, I shall not only dissuade him, but I shall actually warn him against it. As things now stand, a person would, by such a choice of profession, ruin his every chance of success at a university, and if he goes out into the world as a practicing physician, he will find himself in a society which does not understand his aims, which regards him with suspicion and hostility, and which turns loose upon him all the malicious spirits which lurk within it. However, there are always enough individuals who are interested in anything which may be added to the sum total of knowledge despite such inconveniences. Should there be any of this type among you, and should they ignore my dissuasion and return to the next of these lectures, they will be welcome. But all of you have the right to know what these difficulties of psychoanalysis are to which I have alluded. First of all, we encounter the difficulties inherent in the teaching and exposition of psychoanalysis. In your medical instruction, you have been accustomed to visual demonstration. You see the anatomical specimen, the precipitate in the chemical reaction, the contraction of the muscle as the result of the stimulation of its nerves. Later, the patient is presented to your senses. The symptoms of his malady, the products of the pathological processes, in many cases even the cause of the disease, is shown in isolated state. In the surgical department you are made to witness the steps by which one brings relief to the patient and are permitted to attempt to practice them. Even in psychiatry the demonstration affords you, by the patient's changed facial play, his manner of speech and his behavior, a wealth of observations which leave far-reaching impressions. Thus the medical teacher preponderantly plays the role of a guide and instructor who accompanies you through a museum in which you contract an immediate relationship to the exhibits, and in which you believe yourself to have been convinced through your own observation of the existence of the new things you see. Unfortunately, everything is different in psychoanalysis. In psychoanalysis, nothing occurs but the interchange of words between the patient and the physician. The patient talks, tells of his past experiences and present impressions, complains, confesses his wishes and emotions. The physician listens, trying to direct the thought process of the patient, reminds him of things, forces his attention into certain channels, gives him explanations, and observes the reactions of understanding or denial which he calls forth in the patient. The uneducated relatives of our patients, persons who are impressed only by the visible and tangible, preferably by such procedure as one sees in the moving picture theatres, never miss an opportunity of voicing their skepticism as to how one can do anything for the malady through mere talk. Such thinking, of course, is as short-sighted as it is inconsistent, for these are the very persons who know with such certainty that the patients merely imagined their symptoms. Words were originally magic, and the words retain much of its old magical power even today. With words one can make another blessed, or drive him to despair. By words the teacher transfers his knowledge to the pupil. By words the speaker sweeps his audience with him and determines its judgments and decisions. Words call forth effects, and are the universal means of influencing human beings. Therefore, let us not underestimate the use of words in psychotherapy, and let us be satisfied if we may be auditors of the words which are exchanged between the analyst and his patient. But even that is impossible. The conversation of which the psychoanalytic treatment consists brooks no auditor. It cannot be demonstrated. One can, of course, present a neurasthenic or hysteric to the students in a psychiatric lecture. He tells of his complaints and symptoms, but of nothing else. The communications which are necessary for the analysis are made only under the conditions of a special affective relationship to the physician. The patient would become dumb as soon as he became aware of a single impartial witness. For these communications concern the most intimate part of his psychic life, everything which as a socially independent person he must conceal from others. These communications deal with everything which, as a harmonious personality, he will not admit even to himself. You cannot, therefore, listen in on a psychoanalytic treatment. You can only hear of it. You will get to know psychoanalysis in the strictest sense of the word only by hearsay. Such instruction, even at second hand, will place you in quite an unusual position for forming a judgment. For it is obvious that everything depends on the faith you are able to put in the instructor. Imagine that you are not attending a psychiatric, but an historical lecture, and that the lecturer is telling you about the life and martial deeds of Alexander the Great. What would your reasons for believing in the authenticity of his statements? At first sight, the condition of affairs seems even more unfavorable than in the case of psychoanalysis, for the history professor was as little a participant in Alexander's campaigns as you were. The psychoanalyst at least tells you of things in connection with which he himself has played some role. But then the question turns on this: what set of facts can the historian marshal in support of his position? He can refer you to the accounts of ancient authors who were either contemporaries themselves, or who were at least closer to the events in question. That is, he will refer you to the books of Diodor, Plutarch, Arrian, etc. He can place before you pictures of the preserved coins and statues of the king, and can pass down your rows a photograph of the Pompeian mosaics of the Battle of Issos. Yet, strictly speaking, all these documents prove only that previous generations already believed in Alexander's existence and in the reality of his deeds, and your criticism might begin anew at this point. You will then find that not everything recounted of Alexander is credible or capable of proof in detail. Yet even then I cannot believe that you will leave the lecture hall a disbeliever in the reality of Alexander the Great. Your decision will be determined chiefly by two considerations. Firstly, that the lecturer has no conceivable motive for presenting as truth something which he does not himself believe to be true; and secondly, that all available histories present the events in approximately the same manner. If you then proceed to the verification of the older sources, you will consider the same data, the possible motives of the writers, and the consistency of the various parts of the evidence. The result of the examination will surely be convincing in the case of Alexander. It will probably turn out differently when applied to individuals like Moses and Nimrod. But what doubts you might raise against the credibility of the psychoanalytic reporter you will see plainly enough upon a later occasion. At this point you have a right to raise the question: if there is no such thing as objective verification of psychoanalysis, and no possibility of demonstrating it, how can one possibly learn psychoanalysis and convince himself of the truth of its claims? The fact is, the study is not easy, and there are not many persons who have learned psychoanalysis thoroughly. But nevertheless there is a feasible way. Psychoanalysis is learned, first of all, from a study of oneself, through the study of one's own personality. This is not quite what is ordinarily called self-observation, but at a pinch one can sum it up thus. There is a whole series of very common and universally known psychic phenomena, which, after some instruction in the technique of psychoanalysis, one can make the subject matter of analysis in one's self. By doing so, one obtains the desired conviction of the reality of the occurrences which psychoanalysis describes, and of the correctness of its fundamental conception. To be sure, there are definite limits imposed on progress by this method. One gets much further if one allows himself to be analyzed by a competent analyst, observes the effects of the analyst on his own ego, and at the same time makes use of the opportunity to become familiar with the finer details of the technique of procedure. This excellent method is, of course, only practicable for one person, never for an entire class. There is a second difficulty in your relation to psychoanalysis for which I cannot hold the science itself responsible, but for which I must ask you to take the responsibility upon yourselves, ladies and gentlemen, at least in so far as you have hitherto pursued medical studies. Your previous training has given your mental activity a definite bent which leads you far away from psychoanalysis. You have been trained to reduce the functions of an organism and its disorders anatomically, to explain them in terms of chemistry and physics, and to conceive them biologically. But no portion of your interest has been directed to the psychic life, in which, after all, the activity of this wonderfully complex organism culminates. For this reason psychological thinking has remained strange to you, and you have accustomed yourselves to regard it with suspicion, to deny it the character of the scientific, to leave it to the layman poets, natural philosophers, and mystics. Such a delimitation is surely harmful to your medical activity, for the patient will, as is usual in all human relationships, confront you first of all with his psychic facade, and I am afraid your penalty will be this, that you will be forced to relinquish a portion of the therapeutic influence to which you aspire, to those lay physicians, nature cure fakers, and mystics whom you despise. I am not overlooking the excuse, whose existence one must admit, for this deficiency in your previous training. There is no philosophical science of therapy which could be made practicable for your medical purpose. Neither speculative philosophy, nor descriptive psychology, nor that so-called experimental psychology, which allies itself with the physiology of the sense organs as it is taught in the schools, is in a position to teach you anything useful concerning the relation between the physical and the psychical, or to put into your hand the key to the understanding of a possible disorder of the psychic functions. Within the field of medicine, psychiatry does, it is true, occupy itself with the description of the observed psychic disorders and with their grouping into clinical symptom pictures. But in their better hours the psychiatrists themselves doubt whether their purely descriptive account deserves the name of a science. The symptoms which constitute these clinical pictures are known neither in their origin, in their mechanism, nor in their mutual relationship. There are either no discoverable corresponding changes of the anatomical organ of the soul, or else the changes are of such a nature as to yield no enlightenment. Such psychic disturbances are open to therapeutic influence only when they can be identified as secondary phenomena of an otherwise organic affection. Here is the gap which psychoanalysis aims to fill. It prepares to give psychiatry the omitted psychological foundation. It hopes to reveal the common basis from which, as a starting point, constant correlation of bodily and psychic disturbances become comprehensible. To this end, it must divorce itself from every anatomical, chemical, or physiological supposition which is alien to it. It must work throughout with purely psychological therapeutic concepts, and just for that reason I fear that it will at first seem strange to you. I will not make you, your previous training, or your mental bias share the guilt of the next difficulty. With two of its assertions, psychoanalysis offends the whole world and draws aversion upon itself. One of these assertions offends an intellectual prejudice, the other an aesthetic moral one. Let us not think too lightly of these prejudices. They are powerful things, remnants of useful, even necessary, developments of mankind. They are retained through powerful effects, and the battle against them is a hard one. The first of these displeasing assertions of psychoanalysis is this: that the psychic processes are in themselves unconscious, and that those which are conscious are merely isolated acts and parts of the total psychic life. Recollect that we are, on the contrary, accustomed to identify the psychic with the conscious. Consciousness actually means for us the distinguishing characteristic of the psychic life, and psychology is the science of the content of consciousness. Indeed, so obvious does this identification seem to us that we consider its slightest contradiction obvious nonsense, and yet psychoanalysis cannot avoid raising this contradiction. It cannot accept the identity of the conscious with the psychic. Its definition of the psychic affirms that they are processes of the nature of feeling, thinking, willing, and it must assert that there is such a thing as unconscious thinking and unconscious willing. But with this assertion psychoanalysis has alienated, to start with, the sympathy of all friends of sober science, and has laid itself open to the suspicion of being a fantastic mystery study, which would build in darkness and fish in murky waters. You, however, ladies and gentlemen, naturally cannot as yet understand what justification I have for stigmatizing as a prejudice so abstract a phrase as this one, that the psychic is consciousness. You cannot know what evaluation can have led to the denial of the unconscious, if such a thing really exists, and what advantage may have resulted from this denial. It sounds like a mere argument over words, whether one shall say that the psychic coincides with the conscious, or whether one shall extend it beyond that, and yet I can assure you that by the acceptance of unconscious processes you have paved the way for a decisively new orientation in the world and in science. Just as little can you guess how intimate a connection this initial boldness of psychoanalysis has with the one which follows. The next assertion which psychoanalysis proclaims as one of its discoveries affirms that those instinctive impulses, which one can only call sexual in the narrower as well as in the wider sense, play an uncommonly large role in the causation of nervous and mental diseases, and that those impulses are a causation which has never been adequately appreciated. Nay, indeed, psychoanalysis claims that these sexual impulses have made contributions whose value cannot be overestimated to the highest cultural, artistic, and social achievements of the human mind. According to my experience, the aversion to this conclusion of psychoanalysis is the most significant source of the opposition which it encounters. Would you like to know how we explain this fact? We believe that civilization was forged by the driving force of vital necessity, at the cost of instinct satisfaction, and that the process is to a large extent constantly repeated anew, since each individual who newly enters a human community repeats the sacrifices of his instinct satisfaction for the sake of the common good. Among the instinctive forces thus utilized, the sexual impulses play a significant role. They are thereby sublimated, i.e., they are diverted from their sexual goals and directed to ends socially higher and no longer sexual. But this result is unstable. The sexual instincts are poorly tamed. Each individual who wishes to ally himself with the achievements of civilization is exposed to the danger of having his sexual instincts rebel against this sublimation. Society can conceive of no more serious menace to its civilization than would arise through the satisfying of the sexual instincts by their redirection toward their original goals. Society, therefore, does not relish being reminded of this ticklish spot in its origin. It has no interest in having the strength of the sexual instincts recognized and the meaning of the sexual life to the individual clearly delineated. On the contrary, society has taken the course of diverting attention from this whole field. This is the reason why society will not tolerate the above-mentioned results of psychoanalytic research, and would prefer to brand it as aesthetically offensive and morally objectionable or dangerous. Since, however, one cannot attack an ostensibly objective result of scientific inquiry with such objections, the criticism must be translated to an intellectual level if it is to be voiced. But it is a predisposition of human nature to consider an unpleasant idea untrue, and then it is easy to find arguments against it. Society thus brands what is unpleasant as untrue, denying the conclusions of psychoanalysis with logical and pertinent arguments. These arguments originate from effective sources, however, and society holds to these prejudices against all attempts of refutation. However, we may claim, ladies and gentlemen, that we have followed no bias of any sort in making any of these contested statements. We merely wish to state facts which we believed to have been discovered by toilsome labor, and we now claim the right unconditionally to reject the interference in scientific research of any such practical considerations, even before we have investigated whether the apprehension which these considerations are meant to instill are justified or not. These, therefore, are but a few of the difficulties which stand in the way of your occupation with psychoanalysis. They are perhaps more than enough for a beginning. If you can overcome their deterrent impression, we shall continue. End of section 1. Section 2 of A General Introduction to Psychoanalysis by Sigmund Freud. Translated by Granville Stanley Hall. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ashley Jane. Section 2. Second lecture. The Psychology of Errors. We begin with an investigation, not with hypothesis. To this end, we choose certain phenomena which are very frequent, very familiar, and very little heeded, and which have nothing to do with the pathological, inasmuch as they can be observed in every normal person. I refer to the errors which an individual commits, as for example errors of speech in which he wishes to say something and uses the wrong word, or those which happen to him in writing and which he may or may not notice, or the case of misreading, in which one reads in the print or writing something different from what is actually there. A similar phenomenon occurs in these cases of mishearing what is said to one, where there is no question of an organic disturbance of the auditory function. Another series of such occurrences is based on forgetfulness, but on a forgetfulness which is not permanent but temporary, as for instance when one cannot think of a name which one knows and always recognizes, or when one forgets to carry out a project at the proper time, but which one remembers again later, and therefore has only forgotten for a certain interval. In a third class, this characteristic of transience is lacking, as, for example, in mislaying things so that they cannot be found again, or in the analogous case of losing things. Here we are dealing with a kind of forgetfulness to which one reacts differently from the other cases, a forgetfulness at which one is surprised and annoyed instead of considering it comprehensible. Allied with these phenomena is that of erroneous ideas, in which the element of transience is again prominent, inasmuch as for a while one believes something which before and after that time one knows to be untrue, and a number of similar phenomena of different designations. These are all occurrences whose inner connection is expressed in the use of the same prefix of designation. They are almost all unimportant, generally temporary, and without much significance in the life of the individual. It is only rarely that one of them, such as the phenomenon of losing things, attains to a certain practical importance. For that reason also they do not attract much attention, they arouse only weak effects. It is, therefore, to these phenomena that I would now direct your attention. But you will object with annoyance. There are so many sublime riddles in the external world, just as there are in the narrower world of the psychic life, and so many wonders in the field of psychic disturbances which demand and deserve elucidation, that it really seems frivolous to waste labor and interest on such trifles. If you can explain to us how an individual with sound eyes and ears can, in broad daylight, see and hear things that do not exist, or why another individual suddenly believes himself persecuted by those whom up to that time he loved best, or defend with the most ingenious arguments delusions which must seem nonsense to any child, then we will be willing to consider psychoanalysis seriously. But if psychoanalysis can do nothing better than to occupy us with the question of why a speaker used the wrong word, or why a housekeeper mislaid her keys, or such trifles, then we know something better to do with our time and interest. My answer is patience, ladies and gentlemen. I think your criticism is not on the right track. It is true that psychoanalysis cannot boast that it has never occupied itself with trifles. On the contrary, the objects of its observations are generally those simple occurrences which the other sciences have thrown aside as much too insignificant, the waste products of the phenomenal world. But are you not confounding in your criticism the sublimity of the problems with the conspicuousness of their manifestations? Are there not very important things which under certain circumstances and at certain times can betray themselves only by very faint signs? I could easily cite a great many instances of this kind. From what vague signs, for instance, do the young gentlemen of this audience conclude that they have won the favor of a lady? Do you await an explicit declaration, an ardent embrace, or does not a glance scarcely perceptible to others, a fleeting gesture, a prolonging of a handshake by 1 second, suffice? And if you are a criminal lawyer and engaged in the investigation of a murder, do you actually expect the murderer to leave his photograph and address on the scene of the crime, or would you, of necessity, content yourself with fainter and less certain traces of that individual? Therefore let us not undervalue small signs. Perhaps by means of them we will succeed in getting on the track of greater things. I agree with you that the larger problems of the world and of science have the first claim on our interest. but it is generally of little avail to form the definite resolution to devote oneself to the investigation of this or that problem. Often one does not know in which direction to take the next step. In scientific research it is more fruitful to attempt what happens to be before one at the moment, and for whose investigation there is a discoverable method. If one does that thoroughly without prejudice or predisposition, one may, with good fortune and by virtue of the connection which links each thing to every other, hence also the small to the great, discover even from such modest research a point of approach to study of the big problems. Thus would I answer, in order to secure your attention for the consideration of these apparently insignificant errors made by normal people. At this point we will question a stranger to psychoanalysis and ask him how he explains these occurrences. His first answer is sure to be, "Oh, they are not worth an explanation. They are merely slight accidents." What does he mean by this? Does he mean to assert that there are any occurrences so insignificant that they fall out of the causal sequence of things, or that they might just as well be something different from what they are? If any one thus denies the determination of natural phenomena at one such point, he has vitiated the entire scientific viewpoint. One can then point out to him how much more consistent is the religious point of view when it explicitly asserts that no sparrow falls from the roof without God's special wish. I imagine our friends will not be willing to follow his first answer to its logical conclusion. He will interrupt and say that if he were to study these things he will probably find an explanation for them. He will say that this is a case of slight functional disturbance, of an inaccurate psychic act whose causal factors can be outlined. A man who otherwise speaks correctly may make a slip of the tongue when he is slightly ill or fatigued, when he is excited, when his attention is concentrated on something else. It is easy to prove these statements. Slips of the tongue do really occur with special frequency when one is tired, when one has a headache, or when one is indisposed. Forgetting proper names is a very frequent occurrence under these circumstances. Many persons even recognize the imminence of an indisposition by the ability to recall proper names. Often also one mixes up words or objects during excitement. One picks up the wrong things, and the forgetting of projects, as well as the doing of any number of other unintentional acts, becomes conspicuous when one is distracted. In other words, when one's attention is concentrated on other things. A familiar instance of such distraction is the professor in Fliegende Blätter, which takes the wrong hat because he is thinking of the problems which he wishes to treat in his next book. Each of us knows from experience some examples of how one can forget projects which one has planned and promises which one has made because an experience has intervened which has preoccupied one deeply. This seems both comprehensible and irrefutable. It is perhaps not very interesting, not as we expected it to be. But let us consider this explanation of errors. The conditions which have been cited as necessary for the occurrence of these phenomena are not all identical. Illness and disorders of circulation afford a physiological basis. Excitement, fatigue, and distraction are conditions of a different sort, which one could designate as psychophysiological. About these latter it is easy to theorize. Fatigue, as well as distraction, and perhaps also general excitement, cause a scattering of the attention, which can result in the act in progress not receiving sufficient attention. This act can then be more easily interrupted than usual, and may be inexactly carried out. A slight illness or a change in the distribution of blood in the central organ of the nervous system can have the same effect, inasmuch as it influences the determining factor, the distribution of attention, in a similar way. In all cases, therefore, it is a question of the effects of a distraction of the attention caused either by organic or psychic factors. But this does not seem to yield much of interest for our psychoanalytic investigation. We might even feel tempted to give up the subject. To be sure, when we look more closely, We find that not everything squares with this attention theory of psychological errors, or that at any rate not everything can be directly deduced from it. We find that such errors and such forgetting occur even when people are not fatigued, distracted, or excited, but are in every way in their normal state, unless, in consequence of these errors, one were to attribute them to an excitement which they themselves do not acknowledge. Nor is the mechanism so simple that the success of an act is assured by an intensification of the attention bestowed upon it and endangered by its diminution. There are many acts which one performs in a purely automatic way, and with very little attention, but which are yet carried out quite successfully. The pedestrian who scarcely knows where he is going, nevertheless keeps to the right road and stops at his destination without having gone astray. At least this is the rule. The practiced pianist touches the right keys without thinking of them. He may, of course, also make an occasional mistake, but if automatic playing increased the likelihood of errors, it would be just the virtuoso whose playing has, through practice, become most automatic, who would be the most exposed to this danger. Yet we see, on the contrary, that many acts are most successfully carried out when they are not the objects of particularly concentrated attention, and that the mistakes occur just at the point where one is most anxious to be accurate, where a distraction of the necessary attention is therefore surely least permissible. One could then say that this is the effect of the excitement, but we do not understand why the excitement does not intensify the concentration of attention on the goal that is so much desired. If in an important speech or discussion anyone says the opposite of what he means, then that can hardly be explained according to the psychophysiological or the attention theories. There are also many other small phenomena accompanying these errors, which are not understood and which have not been rendered comprehensible to us by these explanations. For instance, when one has temporarily forgotten a name, one is annoyed, one is determined to recall it, and is unable to give up the attempt. Why is it that despite his annoyance, the individual cannot succeed as he wishes in directing his attention to the word which is on the tip of his tongue, and which he instantly recognizes when it is pronounced to him? Or, to take another example, there are cases in which the errors multiply, link themselves together, substitute for each other. The first time one forgets an appointment, the next time, after having made a special resolution not to forget it, one discovers that one has made a mistake in the day or hour. Or one tries by devious means to remember a forgotten word, and in the course of so doing loses track of the second name which would have been of use in finding the first. If one then pursues this second name, a third gets lost, and so on. It is notorious that the same thing can happen in the case of misprints, which are of course to be considered as errors of the typesetter. A stubborn error of this sort is said to have crept into a social democratic paper, where, in the account of a certain festivity, was printed, "Among those present was His Highness the Clown Prince." The next day a correction was attempted. The paper apologized and said, the sentence should of course have read "the Clown Prince." One likes to attribute these occurrences to the printer's devil, to the goblin of the typesetting machine, and the like, figurative expressions which at least go beyond a psychophysiological theory of the misprint. I do not know if you are acquainted with the fact that one can provoke slips of the tongue, can call them forth by suggestion, as it were. An anecdote will serve to illustrate this. Once, when a novice on the stage was entrusted with the important rôle in The Maid of Orleans of announcing to the king, "Connétable sheathes his sword," the star played the joke of repeating to the frightened beginner during the rehearsal, instead of the text, the following: "Comfortable sends back his steed," and he attained his end. In the performance the unfortunate actor actually made his début with this distorted announcement. even after he had been amply warned against so doing, or perhaps just for that reason. These little characteristics of errors are not exactly illuminated by the theory of diverted attention. But that does not necessarily prove the whole theory wrong. There is perhaps something missing, a complement by the addition of which the theory would be made completely satisfactory. But many of the errors themselves can be regarded from another aspect. Let us select slips of the tongue as best suited to our purpose. We might equally well choose slips of the pen or of reading. But at this point we must make clear to ourselves the fact that so far we have inquired only as to when and under what conditions one's tongue slips, and have received an answer on this point only. One can, however, direct one's interest elsewhere and ask why one makes just this particular slip and no other. One can consider what the slip results in. You must realize that as long as one does not answer this question, does not explain the effect produced by the slip, the phenomenon in its psychological aspect remains an accident, even if its physiological explanation has been found. When it happens that I commit a slip of the tongue, I could obviously make any one of an infinite number of slips, and in place of the one right word say any one of 1,000 others, make innumerable distortions of the right word. Now, is there anything which forces upon me in a specific instance just this one special slip out of all those which are possible, or does that remain accidental and arbitrary, and can nothing rational be found in answer to this question? Two authors, Meringer and Meyer, a philologist and a psychiatrist, did indeed in 1895 make the attempt to approach the problem of slips of the tongue from this side. They collected examples and first treated them from a purely descriptive standpoint. That, of course, does not yet furnish any explanation, but may open the way to one. They differentiated the distortions which the intended phrase suffered through the slip into interchanges of positions of words, interchanges of parts of words, perseverations, compoundings, and substitutions. I will give you examples of these authors' main categories. It is a case of the interchange of the first sort if someone says the Milo of Venus instead of the Venus of Milo. An example of the second type of interchange: I had a blush of rud to the head instead of rush of blood. A perseveration would be the familiar misplaced toast: I ask you to join me in hiccoughing the health of our chief. These three forms of slips are not very frequent. You will find those cases much more frequent in which the slip results from a drawing together or compounding of syllables. For example, a gentleman on the street addresses a lady with the words, "If you will allow me, madam, I should be very glad to escort you." In the compounded word there is obviously, besides the word escort, also the word insult. And parenthetically, we may remark that the young man will not find much favor with the lady. As an example of the substitution, Meringer and Meyer cite the following: a man says, "I put the specimens in the letter box instead of in the hotbed," and the like. The explanation which the two authors attempt to formulate on the basis of this collection of examples is peculiarly inadequate. They hold that the sounds and syllables of words have different values, and that the production and perception of more highly valued syllables can interfere with those of lower values. They obviously base this conclusion on the cases of foresounding and perseveration, which are not at all frequent. In other cases of slips of the tongue, the question of such sound priorities, if any exist, does not enter at all. The most frequent cases of slips of the tongue are those in which instead of a certain word one says another which resembles it, and one may consider this resemblance sufficient explanation. For example, a professor says in his initial lecture, "I am not inclined to evaluate the merits of my predecessor." Or another professor says, "In the case of the female genital, despite many temptations, I mean many attempts, etc. The most common and also the most conspicuous form of slips of the tongue, however, is that of saying the exact opposite of what one means to say. In such cases one goes far afield from the problem of sound relations and resemblance effects, and can cite, instead of these, the fact that opposites have an obviously close relationship to each other, and have particularly close relations in the psychology of association. There are historical examples of this sort. A president of our House of Representatives once opened the assembly with the words, "Gentlemen, I declare a quorum present, and herewith declare the assembly closed." Similar in its trickiness to the relation of opposites is the effect of any other facile association which may under certain circumstances arise most inopportunely. Thus, for instance, there is the story which relates that on the occasion of a festivity in honor of the marriage of a child of H. Helmholtz with a child of the well-known discoverer and captain of industry, W. Simon, the famous physiologist Dubois Raymond was asked to speak. He concluded his undoubtedly sparkling toast with the words, "Success to the new firm, Simons and Halski." That, of course, was the name of the well-known old firm. The association of the two names must have been about as easy for a native of Berlin as Weber and Fields to an American. Thus we must add to the sound relations and word resemblances the influence of word associations. But that is not all. In a series of cases, an explanation of the observed slip is unsuccessful unless we take into account what phrase had been said or even thought previously. This again makes it a case of perseveration, of the sort stressed by Mehringer, but of a longer duration. I must admit I am on the whole of the impression that we are further than ever from an explanation of slips of the tongue. However, I hope I am not wrong when I say that during the above investigation of these examples of slips of the tongue, we have all obtained a new impression on which it will be of value to dwell. We sought the general conditions under which slips of the tongue occur, and then the influences which determine the kind of distortion resulting from the slip. But we have in no way yet considered the effect of the slip on the tongue in itself without regard to its origin. And if we should decide to do so, we must finally have the courage to assert, in some of the examples cited, the product of the slip also makes sense. What do we mean by it makes sense? It means, I think, that the product of the slip has itself a right to be considered as a valid psychic act, which also has its purpose as a manifestation having content and meaning. Hitherto we have always spoken of errors, but now it seems as if sometimes the error itself were quite a normal act, except that it has thrust itself into the place of some other expected or intended act. In isolated cases, this valid meaning seems obvious and unmistakable. When the President, with his opening words, closes the session of the House of Representatives, instead of opening it, we are inclined to consider this error meaningful by reason of our knowledge of the circumstances under which the slip occurred. He expects no good of the assembly, and would be glad if he could terminate it immediately. The pointing out of this meaning, the interpretation of this error, gives us no difficulty. Or a lady pretending to admire says to another, "I am sure you must have messed up this charming hat yourself." No scientific quibbles in the world can keep us from discovering in this slip the idea, "This hat is a mess." Or a lady who is known for her energetic disposition relates, "My husband asked the doctor to what diet he should keep, but the doctor said he didn't need any diet, he should eat and drink whatever I want." This slip of tongue is quite an unmistakable expression of a consistent purpose. Ladies and gentlemen, if it should turn out that not only a few cases of slips of the tongue and of errors in general, but the larger part of them, have a meaning, then this meaning of errors, of which we have hitherto made no mention, will unavoidably become the greatest interest to us, and will, with justice, force all other points of view into the background. We could then ignore all physiological and psychophysiological conditions and devote ourselves to the purely psychological investigations of the sense, that is, the meaning, the purpose of these errors. To this end, therefore, we will not fail shortly to study a more extensive compilation of material. But before we undertake this task, I should like to invite you to follow another line of thought with me. It has repeatedly happened that a poet has made use of slips of the tongue or some other error as a means of poetic presentation. This fact in itself must prove to us that he considers the error, the slip of the tongue for instance, as meaningful. For he creates it on purpose, and it is not a case of the poet committing an accidental slip of the pen and then letting his pen slip stand as a tongue slip of his character. He wants to make something clear to us by this slip of the tongue, and we may examine what it is, whether he wishes to indicate by this that the person in question is distracted or fatigued. Of course, we do not wish to exaggerate the importance of the fact that the poet did make use of a slip to express his meaning. It could nevertheless really be a psychic accident, or meaningful only in very rare cases, and the poet would still retain the right to infuse it with meaning through his setting. As for their poetic use, however, it would not be surprising if we should glean more information concerning slips of the tongue from the poet than from the philologist or the psychiatrist. Such an example of a slip of the tongue occurs in Wallenstein, Piccolomini, Act 1, Scene 5. In the previous scene, Max Piccolomini had most passionately sided with the Herzog, and dilated ardently on the blessings of peace which disclosed themselves to him during the trip on which he accompanied Wallenstein's daughter to the camp. He leaves his father and the courtier, Questenberg, plunged in deepest consternation. And then the fifth scene continues. Questenberg. Alas, alas, and stands it so? What friend? And do we let him go away in this delusion? Let him go away? Not call him back immediately? Not open his eyes upon this spot? Octavio, recovering himself out of a deep study. He has now opened mine, and I see more than pleases me. Questenberg. What is it? Octavio. A curse on this journey. Questenberg. But why so? What is it? Octavio. Come along, friend. I must follow up the ominous track immediately. Mine eyes are opened now, and I must use them. Come. Draws Questenberg on with him. Questenberg. What now? Where go you then? Octavio. Hastily. To her herself. Questenberg. To Octavio. Interrupting him and correcting himself. To the Duke. Come on, let's go. Octavio meant to say, to him, to the Lord. But his tongue slips, and through his words to her he betrays to us at least the fact that he had quite clearly recognized the influence which makes the young war hero dream of peace. A still more impressive example was found by O. Rank in Shakespeare. It occurs in The Merchant of Venice, in the famous scene in which the fortunate suitor makes his choice among the three caskets. And perhaps I can do no better than to read to you here Rank's short account of the incident. A slip of the tongue which occurs in Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, Act 3, Scene 2, is exceedingly delicate in its poetic motivation and technically brilliant in its handling. Like the slip of Wallenstein, quoted by Freud, Psychopathology of Everyday Life, 2nd edition, page 48, it shows that the poets well know the meaning of these errors and assume their comprehensibility to the audience. Portia, who by her father's wish has been bound to the choice of a husband by lot, has so far escaped all her unfavored suitors through the fortunes of chance. Since she has finally found in Bassanio the suitor to whom she is attached, she fears that he, too, will choose the wrong casket. She would like to tell him that even in that event he may rest assured of her love, but is prevented from so doing by her oath. In this inner conflict the poet makes her say to the welcome suitor, I pray you tarry, Pause a day or two before you hazard, for in choosing wrong I lose your company. Therefore forbear a while. There's something tells me, but it is not love. I would not lose you. I could teach you how to choose right, but then I am forsworn. So will I never be, so may you miss me. But if you do, you'll make me wish a sin that I had been forsworn. Beshrew your eyes. They have o'erlooked me and divided me. One half of me is yours, the other half yours. Mine own, I would say, but if mine, then yours, and so all yours. Just that, therefore, which she meant merely to indicate faintly to him, or really to conceal from him entirely, namely that even before the choice of the lot, she was his and loved him. This the poet, with admirable psychological delicacy of feeling, makes apparent by her slip, and is able by this artistic device to quiet the unbearable uncertainty of the lover, as well as the equal suspense of the audience as to the issue of the choice. Notice at the end how subtly Portia reconciles the two declarations which are contained in the slip, how she resolves the contradiction between them, and finally still manages to keep her promise. But if mine, then yours, and so all yours. Another thinker, alien to the field of medicine, accidentally disclosed the meaning of errors by an observation which has anticipated our attempts at explanation. You all know the clever satires of Lichtenberg, 1742 to 1749, of which Goethe said, "Where he jokes, there lurks a problem concealed." Not infrequently, the joke also brings to light the solution of the problem. Lichtenberg mentions in his jokes and satiric comments the remark that he always read Agamemnon for Angenommen, so intently had he read Homer. Herein is really contained the whole theory of misreadings. At the next session we will see whether we can agree with the poets in their conception of the meaning of psychological errors. End of section 2.